Good evening. My name is Christine Fear-Hinsey. I'm a professor in the theology department, and I also have the privilege of being the director of the Francis and Ann Curran Center for American Catholic Studies here at Fordham, who is sponsoring this lecture tonight. This is our 15th year as a center, and so it's a whole year of celebration, but a special year of celebration for this lectureship, the Rita Cassella Jones Lectureship, named in honor of the late Rita Cassella Jones, who was the spouse of the late Dr. Robert Jones, who taught history here at Fordham for many years. And when Rita passed away, Robert and his children wanted to remember Rita, and they were friends with Father Massa, who was our initial director at the time. And one of the things that was striking about Rita, there were many, many things, but one was that she loved thinking about, talking about, hearing about issues in the Catholic Church. And she was one of the Curran Center's first fans. She would come to our events and so forth. And so they had the idea, which was brilliant, to say, why don't we have a lectureship on women in American Catholicism and dedicate it in the name of Rita Cassella Jones. And so that was 15 years ago, and here we are at the 15th anniversary. I'd like to also mention that although I'll say more in a minute about our speaker, we have a beautiful sort of bookend experience going on, because the very first lecturer for this series in 2004, sorry, math, not my strong suit, was a professor from Manhattan College, Professor Julie Picior, who gave a lecture on, the inaugural lecture on Thomas Merton and Catherine de Hoyk. And I believe she's with us tonight. Are you here, Julie? Stand up. And today, 15 years later, we have a lecture by a professor from Manhattan College. So it's a very nice, there's something very nice about the symmetry there. So thank you so much for being with us. The Curran Center is a wonderful place that does all sorts of things. We have a concentration in Catholic studies. A number of our students are here. We do events, as you know. We do scholarship. We do research. There's more information on the front table. Also, our website is full of information, and we would especially like to mention to you that on June 4th here at Rose Hill, we're going to be having our 15th anniversary gala in the evening. And so we would love to see any of you and all of you for that. Our special guest will be, an honoree will be Father Mark Massa, who was our founding director. So please mark your calendars. I also would like to thank the people who make this possible, my colleagues in the Curran Center, particularly Mrs. Maria Terzulli, who makes all this come together and happen. Along with the faculty and staff, who include Professor Angela O'Donnell, Professor John Seitz, Professor Michael Peppard, and the students and other people who help us make these events come to life. Everybody here at Fordham who makes it happen. It's always a team effort, so we're really grateful. But we're especially grateful on behalf of all of us to all of you for being here tonight. Another neat thing about tonight is that as this event has happened over the last 15 years, different members of the Jones family have joined us, and I think tonight, we have an unprecedented number of the next third generation of Joneses. So we have several of the grandchildren here today. Let's see if I can remember of the Jones family. We have William and Sam and Claire and Charlotte and Sophie. So thank you. It's the next Jones generation that is upholding this tradition. So it's wonderful to have you along with, those of us who've seen each other quite often over the last 15 years. Let me turn now to introduce our speaker. Natalia Imperatory Lee is a professor of religious studies, as I mentioned, at Manhattan College in the Bronx, where she also coordinates the Catholic Studies program at that school. She is the author of the book, most recently, Cuéntame, Narrative in the Ecclesial Present. Her work focuses on the intersection of Latinx theologies, feminist theologies, and Catholic ecclesiology. She is published in some of the top journals in our field, including Theological Studies and the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion. A native of Miami, Florida, Professor Imperatori-Lee has served on the board of directors of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the U.S. Recently, she was part of a series of seminars where she presented to bishops, right, to bishops and pastoral workers throughout the country on the implementation of Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia. It's a wonderful thing when bishops come to listen to lay people and lay women theologians, and that was a really impressive set of events. At Manhattan College, Dr. Imperatori Lee teaches courses on contemporary Catholicism, including Vatican II, as well as courses like Sexuality and the Sacred and Women in Western Religion. Currently, she's working on a book about women in the Catholic Church. Dr. Imperatori Lee also speaks regularly outside the walls of academe at parishes, universities, and other venues about feminism, faith, and the Latinx communities in the United States. Her writing has appeared in Commonwealth and America magazines. And you may have seen her on TV. She has been a guest expert on Pope Francis on CNN and MSNBC. She lives in the Bronx with her spouse and 2 sons, and we couldn't be happier to have her with us tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Natalia Imperatory Lee, who will deliver her lecture entitled Cuéntame, How Women's Storytelling Shapes the Future of the Church. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm so grateful to the Curran Center. I'm grateful to the Theology Department, and I'm especially grateful to the Jones family for the honor of inviting me to address you as the quinceañera of the Rita Cassella Jones lecture. Had I made that connection earlier, I would have worn a poofier dress. So I apologize that I am underdressed for the 15s. I suppose it is the dream of every undergraduate nerd to one day be invited back to their alma mater to deliver a lecture on her own work. It's not something I thought I would live out, and I, like I said, am incredibly grateful to be with you in this dreamlike space. As a student, 25 years ago, as I was so gratefully reminded, I arrived at Fordham, and I spent a lot of time in this building when it was the library. The Beauty and the Beast library is how I referred to it, because that's sort of what it looks like. I would explore the shelves that were filled with theology that I had no idea about, and an incredible amount of curiosity about all sorts of things. I knew I wanted to study theology, and I was pretty much ignorant of everything else, especially about what American Catholic studies might be. I never thought to focus on American Catholic studies, probably because American was not something that I felt that I was. I was very Cuban, and I was extremely Cuban at Fordham. It became very obvious to me how not American I was. And this was a notion that was reinforced when I learned about what American Catholicism was. Notre Dame, Dorothy Day, Fulton Sheen, Flannery O'Connor. I knew nothing about any of those things, and nothing of the religiosity that they implied. My Catholicism was and remains like something from another planet, done as much at home as in church, though at 17 I was like an unrepentant church mouse. I feel really compelled to tell you that. My religiosity was mixed with spiritualist prayers. It was addled with extras, like rosary novenas in my living room led by my mother, wearing black or lavender whenever somebody would die. The story of American Catholicism that I came to know in the late 90s, and that, to be honest, I still see in some places, is as foreign to the Catholicism of my youth as El Trio Matamoros is to many of you. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about tonight. Just this weekend, I was reading a memoir by Janine Capó-Cruzet, a Cuban-American writer. I promise I read other people too, but I really like her. She's from Hialeah, where my father worked, who was born 4 years after me in 1980. Like me, she came to college in New York. She went to Cornell, utterly blind and completely by chance. She liked it. She saw the name. She thought it was a good place, and so she applied and got in. She wound up becoming a professional writer and a professor of creative writing now in Nebraska. In her memoir entitled My Time Among the Whites, Crusette tells a story about how visits to Disney World, which is a feature of both of our upbringings, served to supplant the fantasy that our parents had fed us of a pre-Castro Cuba with a different Caribbean, one in the Pirates ride. I don't know if you've ever been, right? Everyone's been, where the only language you hear is English. In concluding that story, where she talks about misogyny and colonization and various other Disney products, she notes, control the fantasy and you control the people. Whoever controls the story controls people, puts fences on imaginations, sketches the possible. This is why I'm so committed to getting our stories right, to getting a wide variety of stories told, and to honor the dangerous memories that make up the tapestry that is American Catholicism. So, oh, by the way, that is me and my mom in the corner there, me in the thighs. Yeah, that's me. So I'd like to begin with a question that Ross Douthat asked today too, so why not? I didn't pay him to. I wish I did. I like to begin these kinds of talks by clarifying a very important word that I use a lot, which is Latinx. Many people have never heard the term. In fact, last year when I was on that Amoris Laetitia tour, Bishop McElroy of San Diego got the courage, even though he's enormous and very important. I don't know what he needed courage for, but he kind of sidled up to me when we were walking to dinner and said, now, what is it that you mean by Latinx? And how do you spell it? I was like, okay. So here's what I told him. Because since I don't need to tell a room of New Yorkers, Spanish is a gendered language. Its nouns reflect one half of the human community at best. So when we want to speak about all Latinos and Latinas, we end up having to say Latino a, or Latinas os, or some other mashup of these words, and I find that clunky. It forces you to put one gender first, and that gets tricky, or you try to alternate them and then forget. The X, I think, has an additional advantage in that it includes people who don't identify strictly within the gender binary, so for example, some members of the LGBTQ community. So scholars are increasingly turning to Latinx as a term of choice. But this is not without its detractors, among them, apparently, the New York Times opinion page. The critiques of Latinx note that it centers a colonial view, and this is true, right? It is a homogenization of a variety of cultures, like Hispanic, in the service of a dominant culture. A major theme of my work, in fact, is how language shapes our imaginations and is shaped by our contexts. If we live in a colonialized context, our imaginations, our language, are shaped by dominant cultures. This is a problem. Language is thorny, right? It conceals and it reveals. So in my remarks tonight, I'll probably alternate between Latinx and Latinos, Latinas. Sometimes I use one or the other. Sometimes I say Hispanic. Sometimes I'll say Hispanophone to refer to people who are Spanish-speaking. All of these are imperfect options. I don't know Latinos who refer to themselves as Latinos, right? Everyone is Mexican-American or Peruvian or Cuban-American or Salvadoran. So even Latinos is sort of a construct. So why don't we just deal with the fact that all of it is a construct? And that's what we're going to do tonight. Join me. Tonight we're going to explore the intersection of language, experience, and theological production. I want to talk about stories. What kinds of stories matter? Who gets to frame and tell those stories? And how shifting our stories shifts our ecclesial self-understanding, our knowledge of ourselves as church. We know from demographic studies, some of which I'll cite in a bit, that the church in the US is once again increasingly made up of Latinx Catholics. The language we use for this demographic reality tells an interesting story. Frequently, words like the new face of Catholicism, or the emerging Latinx majority, or the recent immigrants from Latin America are the subjects of our statements. This might lead people to believe that Latinos and Latinas are relative newcomers to American Catholicism, or even outsiders. This brings me to my first animating question of the evening, which is whose experience counts theologically? We know that experience is a theological category, and the Church affirmed this at Vatican II. The Council taught us that the whole people of God, all of us, have an intuition of the faith, which they called a sensus fidei, that can recognize the gospel innately and experientially. This sense of the faith allows all of us to participate fully and actively in the life of the Church, in preserving and promoting the gospel. But for many years, especially among some who chronicle American Catholicism, some Catholics' sense or experience seemed to count more than others. The Church continues to struggle, I think, with the matter of the sensus fidei, with the overpowering witness of Latinx experience throughout American history, with accounting for the reality of the people of God and our role in preserving the tradition handed down apostolically. We're left out of the story, or let into the story, but only as newcomers. Now, stories are incredibly important to the way all people learn and engage the divine reality. So when we realize this and ask the question, whose experience counts, we have a lot of fruit for exploration and discussion. The dynamic realities of story and experience also explain my somewhat weird bilingual book title that is also the title of this talk, Cuéntame. Here's a story from my childhood. Right? Some of my earliest memories involve hearing my mother on the phone with her mother, or with her aunts or some friend, sitting onto the couch slowly, like easing down into it, and saying, a ver, cuéntame, like that really long E. When I see that word, I still hear it in my head in the rhythm and the timbre of her voice. And it rings like an invitation, right? This will not be a quick conversation. It's a good, long, sort of filled with gossip that a very curious child can overhear. But cuéntame has a double meaning. While it means tell me in an inquiring context, when said imperatively, it demands that the speaker be counted. Do not leave me out. When we think about the church of the present and of the future, both meanings to my mind are vitally important. Accounts, recounting, and being counted, all meanings contained in the verb contar, all vital to the stories we tell. Tonight we're talking about three stories. The demographic story, and the problem of accounting. You're an accountant, right? You know all about the problems of accounting. The historical story and the role of dangerous memory. And the literary aesthetic story and its power to reveal the sense of the faith. So first, the numbers. I don't want to spend a ton of time telling you the demographics because by now we've all likely heard this breakdown of the Catholic Church in the US. The numbers of Americans of Latinx descent continues to grow. The majority of these persons identify as Roman Catholic. Some brief highlights of the demographic picture are up here. As of 2015, there are 56.6 million Latinx persons in the US. That is 17.6% of the total US population. The population of Latinx persons in the US is the second size ranking worldwide. Only Mexico has more Latinx persons than the US. 57% of Hispanics in the US consider themselves Roman Catholics, which is approximately 38% of the whole Catholic population. It is a young and faithful population with approximately half attending church regularly. More than half of US millennial Catholics, which is born 1982 or later. How many of you were born in 1982 or later? Okay. More than half of US millennial Catholics are Latinx. The Latinx population makes up at least half of many major archdioceses, including New York. In fact, in 4 out of the 5 boroughs, the percentage of Hispanic Catholics almost doubles the number of non-Hispanic Catholics. There's only one where it doesn't. Can anybody guess which one that is? Yes, Staten Island. What's going on in Staten Island? It's so awesome. But the best tidbit, so a third of US parishes celebrate Mass in a language other than English, and most of the time that's Spanish. And here in our boogie down Bronx home, 3 in 10 residents of this fair borough are Latinx Catholics. Not 3 in 10 of the Catholic residents, 3 in 10 of the humans living in the Bronx are Latinx Catholics. I have a lot of fun thinking about numbers like this, and to think about ways in which this premier Catholic university can still work to match the numbers of the beautiful Bronx, where it sits. What demographers tell us about the future of the Catholic Church in the US is that it will in all likelihood be more Spanish-speaking, more diverse, and have more ties to the global South in the coming years. The majority of Roman Catholics in this country will soon be Latinx, as you can see in this slide that charts age distributions. The Latinos are orange, and the whites are the dotted line. You are old, and we are young. This evolving demographic reality frequently frames the story of Latinx Catholicism in this country, but while the numbers are important, they really only tell part of the story. We can count the number of people of Latinx heritage in this country, and we can make predictions about future numbers and rates of growth or rates of change. And this is important work, but it's not enough to make an ecclesiology. It's not enough to tell the story of the church. If we're trying to discern whose experience counts, we need to first count the who's in question. But we also need an account, a narrative of who the church is. This is accomplished in two ways in ecclesiology. We can tell a historical story, and we can take an account of the sense of the faithful. The next 2 points I want to make will take up each of these tasks in turns. So first, the historical story. Look at that nun. The way we tell the historical story is broken. The narrative of North American Catholicism, including its origin story somewhere in Maryland, I think, and then spreading south and west from there, it's just not true. If we're going to elaborate good ecclesiology, we have to first of all tell a true story. Irish theologian John O'Brien, whose article totally inspired me to write this book, writes that ecclesiology has always taken the form of a narrative, or more precisely, a conversation between narratives. In fact, narrative and storytelling could even be said to be the bedrock of Christianity, grounded as it is in gospel narratives, which themselves tell the stories of Jesus' own storytelling, right? It's like a narrative inception. And Jesus taught through parables, right? So there's all these storytellings are this kind of bedrock of Christianity. Ecclesiologists want to tell the story of the church by intertwining historical analysis, philosophical depth, and the complexity of the human experience of salvation history. 50 years after the Second Vatican Council, the church's reality has expanded to reflect its global identity, but the U.S. church's story remains a work in progress. If narrative is the proper form of ecclesiology, then understanding the historical narrative of the church seems essential to grasping the whole story of salvation, and ultimately to constructing an ecclesiology that takes seriously the genuine varieties of Christian experience. Recently, theologians have indicated the importance of the experience of particular local churches in accounting for the genuine diversity and legitimate variety within Catholicism. In contrast to grand meta-narratives, right, generalized accounts that erase differences in favor of a unifying story, an emphasis on stories of particularity allows ecclesiologists to avoid marginalizing non-dominant voices. Further, telling these particular stories in all their diversity reveals, in some sense, the invariable core of the Christian message in all its various cultural, historical, and linguistic expressions. However, even particular narratives have the potential to marginalize some accounts in favor of others. In the U.S. context, the experience of U.S. Latinx Catholics has been made to fit uncomfortably at times into a particular historical narrative that emphasizes the arc of immigration and eventual assimilation, or Americanization. In addition, the